Listen here now, children of this weary land. In the belly of a slave ship crossing the dark Atlantic, where souls lay chained in their own blood and vomit, there was born a promise that death could not break. The iron ate into flesh, but it could not devour the spirit that whispered in Yoruba, in Igbo, in languages the ocean tried to swallow whole. And from that suffering, from that middle passage of tears and salt, came stories that refused to die. Tonight I tell you about Emma, not Emma the broken, but Emma who took the whip from the devil's own hand. Her mama named her in secret, her daddy sold away like cattle, but her spirit, Lord have mercy, her spirit belonged to the ancestors who crossed that terrible water. So gather close, for this tale carries the weight of iron shackles and the fire of rebellion, and it must be told true, for the dead demand their testimony. Now listen here, child, and don't you turn away from what I'm about to tell. This here story ain't for the weak-hearted, or them that like their history cleaned and pressed like Sunday clothes. No, sir, this is blood and iron truth, passed down from mouth to mouth like sacred bread in the quarters when the massa slept sound in his big house. The old ones warned us, they did. They said some stories carry such weight they bend the very air around 'em, make the night hold its breath, and the wind speak in tongues long silenced. This here tale of Emma be one of them stories. Born in the red clay soil of Georgia, where the cotton grew tall as a man's hopes and white as his lies. Folks swear on their lives they seen her shadow still walking them fields at dusk, when the Spanish moss hangs heavy like the ghosts of the hanged. They say, if you listen close on a moonless night, you can still hear the crack of leather meetin' flesh, still hear the silence that came after she took that whip and turned it around on its master. In them days of deep sorrow, when a black soul was worth less than a good horse and twice as expendable, there was plantations spread across the South like boils on the earth's skin. Magnolia Grove Plantation sat heavy on 1,000 acres of stolen Cherokee land, where the Chattahoochee River bent like a broken spine, and the soil drunk up more blood than rainwater. The big house rose white and proud as Satan's teeth, with columns tall enough to mock the very heavens. Inside, crystal glasses caught light like trapped stars, while outside, in the quarters, children slept on dirt floors and dreamed of freedom they'd never taste. The overseer's house stood between, like a watchful demon guarding the gates between heaven and hell. But it was in them quarters, in them cabins built of pine and pain, where the real power lived, where the conjure women mixed roots by candlelight and the old ones sang work songs that carried messages the white folks couldn't read, where mothers whispered African names to babies born into chains, planting seeds of identity that no massa could harvest. Emma's story began there, in that space between suffering and hope, where even the air was thick with sorrow, and the very walls seemed to weep for all they'd witnessed. The land itself carried heavy spirits, and every sunrise brought fresh reminders that freedom was a luxury only white skin could afford. The night Emma drew her first breath, the midwife said the very stars held their tongues in respect. Her mama, Casey, though the white folks called her Bessie like they owned even the sound of her name, lay on a straw mattress in the birthing cabin, her body racked with the kind of pain that makes a woman call on ancestors she ain't never met. "Push now, daughter," old Mama Juba whispered, her hands dark as river stones and twice as gentle. Push that child into this cruel world, but don't you let this world push back on her spirit. Mama Juba was the quarter's granny midwife, root doctor, and keeper of secret names. Her own back carried scars from 50 years of cotton and cruelty, but her eyes still held fire enough to stare down the devil himself. When Emma slid wet and wailing into those weathered hands, Mama Juba felt something different about this child. The baby's cry was strong, not the weak mewling of a spirit already broken, but a sound like distant thunder, promising storms to come. "This one," she said soft-like to Casey, "this one ain't gonna bow easy." Casey looked at her daughter through tears of exhaustion and terror. In the dim light of tallow candles, she could see the child's eyes were already open, staring up like she was reading something written in the shadows of the cabin roof. "Her name," Casey whispered, so low even the spirits had to lean close to hear. "Her true name be Emma. Not whatever lies they write in their books, but Emma. You remember that, child. You remember who you are when they try to tell you what you ain't." Mama Juba nodded, understanding the weight of that secret. In them days, even a name was property the massa could take and change at will. Slave children got called whatever struck the white folks' fancy: Dinah, Pompey, Caesar, names meant to mock or amuse, never to honor. But a true name, whispered in the darkness of the quarters, that was something they couldn't touch. Outside the cabin, the Georgia night pressed down like a heavy quilt, and in the big house, Master Thornfield slept sound in his feather bed, never knowing that on this night, under his very nose, a revolution had been born in the body of a baby girl who would one day make him remember that chains can break both ways. Casey held her daughter close, breathing in that new baby smell that was like hope mixed with fear. She knew this child would grow up knowing hunger and hardship, would feel the bite of the overseer's whip and the weight of impossible labor. But she also knew that somewhere deep in Emma's blood ran the memory of African queens and warriors, of women who'd fought lions and led armies, of ancestors who'd survived the Middle Passage with their spirits intact. "Emma," she said again, tasting the freedom in that name like sweet water after years of drought. "You gonna carry all our hopes, child, all our prayers, and all our pain. But don't you never forget, you ain't nobody's property but your own." Dawn broke over Magnolia Grove like a slap across the face, and with it came the horn blast that jerked every soul in the quarters from whatever peace sleep might have offered. The plantation stretched out under the morning sun like a kingdom built on bones, every acre a testament to white greed and black suffering. The big house sat at the heart of it all, whitewashed and gleaming like a tomb full of treasures. Master Thornfield's great-grandfather had built it with money made from buying and selling human flesh, and 3 generations had added to its splendor with each harvest of cotton and misery. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears in rooms where no black foot was allowed to tread, except to clean and serve. 200 yards south, connected by a dirt road worn smooth by bare feet and wagon wheels, stood the overseer's house. Smaller than the big house but still built to impress, it was painted yellow like a coward's belly, and had glass windows that caught the sun's glare and threw it back like accusations. This was where Jacob Morrison lived, the man whose job it was to squeeze every ounce of labor from black bodies while keeping his hands clean enough to sit at the master's table. But it was beyond that house, past the cotton gin and the smokehouse, past the tool shed and the punishment post, that the real world began. The quarters stretched out in 2 long rows of cabins, 24 shacks built of pine boards and patched with whatever scraps could be found. Each cabin housed anywhere from 6 to 12 souls, depending on how many children had been born that year and how many had died or been sold away. These cabins were built low and tight, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked when the rains came hard. 1 small window per cabin, no bigger than a Bible, let in what light it could. The smell was always the same: wood smoke, unwashed bodies, corn mush, and underneath it all, the metallic scent of fear that never quite washed away. Between the 2 rows of cabins lay the common area where children played with corn-husk dolls and sticks, where the women gathered to mend clothes and share what news they dared speak aloud, where the men sat in the evenings and tried to forget the weight of another day, survived. At the center of this space stood the whipping post, a thick oak pole driven deep into the red Georgia clay and worn smooth by the hands of those tied to it. That post was Morrison's favorite sermon, his way of preaching obedience without words. It stood there day and night like a scarecrow for human spirits, reminding every soul in the quarters that defiance had a price, and that price was measured in blood and screaming. The ground round that post was darker than the rest, stained, permanent with the life that had leaked from too many backs torn open by leather and steel. At sunrise every morning, Morrison would stand on his porch with his coffee cup and survey his kingdom of chains. He'd watch as the slaves stumbled from their cabins, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, and form up for the day's assignments. Field hands to the cotton, house servants to the big house, children old enough to work to whatever task needed small hands. Emma grew up seeing that scene every day, learning early that her world was divided into 3 parts: the big house where the white folks lived like kings, the overseer's house where cruelty had a roof over its head, and the quarters where humanity was rationed out like spare cornmeal. She learned to read the signs. When Morrison's face looked stormy, everyone moved quicker. When Master Thornfield rode out to inspect the fields, every back bent lower. When the paddy rollers came sniffing around at night, every door stayed locked tight and every prayer got said twice. This was the world that shaped her, a world where mercy was scarce as hen's teeth and justice was whatever the white man said it was. But Emma also learned the other truth the quarters held: that people could survive anything if they held tight to each other, that hope could hide in a work song, and that sometimes, when the moon was dark and the spirits were angry, even the most beaten-down soul could rise up and bite back. The old ones warned us, and they spoke true. Some stories carry the weight of iron and fire, and Emma's story was just beginning to burn. In them quarters, in that space between the whipping post and the hope that lived in whispered names, a revolution was learning to walk on bare feet and dream with open eyes. Lord, have mercy on us all, for what was coming would shake the very foundations of that plantation and prove that no chain is strong enough to hold a spirit that refuses to stay broken. When Emma was no bigger than a cotton ball herself, barely 6 summers old, Master Thornfield decided it was time to thin out his human stock. Times had been lean that year. A blight had taken half the cotton crop, and the bills from his gambling debts in Savannah were piling up like storm clouds. So he did what masters always did when money got tight. He sold flesh to pay for flesh. The auction block in Athens was a 3-day ride from Magnolia Grove, but the news traveled faster than any horse. Word came down through the quarters like fever spreading through a sick house. Families were gonna be broken, children torn from their mother's arms like fruit picked before its time. The very air in the quarters grew thick with dread, and even the strongest men walked with their heads hung low, knowing there wasn't a damn thing they could do to stop what was coming. Emma's daddy, they called him Big Tom on account of his size and the way he could lift cotton bales that took 2 other men to budge. But his real name, the one Casey whispered in the dark, was Kwame, a name that meant Saturday in the old tongue, given to him by his grandmother, who remembered the taste of African soil. Big Tom had hands that could gentle a spooked horse or build a cabin that would stand through any storm. But those same hands shook like leaves when he heard his name called out at morning roll. "Tom, you're bound for Athens come Monday," Morrison announced, his voice flat as week-old cornbread. "Master's got a buyer lined up. Cotton plantation down in Alabama needs strong backs." He said it like he was talking about selling a plow or a milk cow, not tearing the heart out of a family that had been together since before Emma drew breath. That Sunday night, the last night they'd ever spend together, Kwame held his daughter on his lap while Kesey sat beside them, her tears falling silent as summer rain. They were squeezed into their cabin with Emma's 2 older brothers, Marcus and Samuel, everybody knowing this was goodbye, but nobody able to say the word out loud. "You listen to your mama, little bird," Kwame whispered into Emma's hair, using the pet name he'd given her when she first started walking. "You be strong like the river that keeps flowing no matter what rocks try to dam it up. And you remember, ain't no master owns what's in here." He pressed his big hand against her small chest, right over her heart. Emma didn't understand then what was happening, didn't grasp the finality of it. All she knew was that her daddy's voice sounded different, broken somehow, like when the preachers spoke about Moses wandering in the wilderness. She curled up against his chest and listened to the sound of his heart beating, not knowing it was the last lullaby she'd ever hear from him. Monday morning came like a judgment day. Morrison showed up with 2 white men Emma had never seen before, slave traders with hard faces and harder hearts, men who made their living buying and selling human sorrow. They had chains ready, iron shackles that clinked like death bells in the morning air. The whole quarters turned out to watch, not by choice, but because Morrison made it clear that anybody who stayed in their cabin would be next on the block. So they stood there, men and women and children, watching as families were ripped apart like pages torn from a book. Old Moses, who told stories of Africa to the children. Young Sarah, who was heavy with her first child. 3 of the Williams boys, sold together but away from their parents. And Big Tom standing tall even with iron round his wrists, his eyes locked on his family like he was trying to memorize their faces. Emma broke away from her mother's grip and ran toward her daddy, her little legs carrying her faster than Kesey could follow. She wrapped her arms around his legs, hugging tight as she could, and for a moment, the whole auction party stopped to watch this tiny girl clinging to her father like ivy on an oak tree. "Daddy, don't go," she cried, the words ripping from her throat like they were tearing her apart. "Please don't leave me, Daddy." One of the traders moved to pull her away, but Big Tom fixed him with a look that could have melted iron. "Let me say goodbye to my child," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even white men pause. He knelt down so he was eye level with Emma, and she could see her own face reflected in his tears. "I ain't leaving you, little bird," he said, soft but firm. "I'm gonna live right here." Again, he touched her chest, over her heart. "Long as you remember the stories I told you, long as you remember your daddy loved you more than all the stars in the sky, I ain't never really gone. You understand?" Emma nodded, though she didn't really understand. Not then. She was too young to grasp the economics of slavery, too innocent to know that love meant nothing when money was at stake. All she knew was that the most important person in her world was being taken away, and there wasn't nobody strong enough to stop it. They loaded him onto the wagon with the others, chains rattling like angry ghosts. As the wheels started turning, Big Tom called out one last time, "Remember who you are, Emma! Remember your name!" His voice carried across the fields, even after the wagon disappeared behind the trees, echoing like a promise and a prayer rolled into one. That night, Emma cried herself to sleep in her mother's arms, while Casey hummed old songs that carried the pain of 10,000 mothers who'd lost their children to the auction block. Outside, the whipping post stood silent as a gravestone, and the wind through the Spanish moss sounded like all the fathers who'd been sold away, still calling their children's names into the darkness. From that day forward, Emma understood the most important lesson of slavery. Love was a luxury that could be sold away without warning, and the only thing that truly belonged to you was what you carried in your heart. She learned that lesson at 6 years old, and it cut deeper than any whip ever would. After her daddy was sold away, Emma learned the hardest lesson the quarters could teach: how to bury your pain so deep it couldn't be used against you. Kessie taught her this the way other mothers might teach their children to read or sew, because in the world they lived in, hiding your hurt was the difference between surviving and breaking into pieces too small to put back together. "Tears are precious as water in the desert," Casey would whisper to Emma as they sat mending clothes by candlelight. "Don't you waste 'em where the wrong folks can see. Save 'em for when you're alone with the ancestors, when the night is dark and your heart needs cleansing. But when the sun comes up and Morrison starts prowling, you put on your mask and you wear it tight." So Emma learned to cry silent tears, the kind that fell inside where nobody could count them or use them for entertainment. She learned to keep her face smooth as riverstone when the white folks looked her way, to nod and say, "Yes, suh," and "No, ma'am," like her spirit hadn't been branded with her daddy's absence. She learned to sing while she worked, not because she was happy, but because singing kept the screams locked up safe in her chest. By the time she was 10, Emma could pick cotton faster than children twice her age, her small fingers dancing through the bowls like she'd been born for it. But inside, behind that careful mask, she was building something else entirely. She was building a fortress of memory where she kept every story her daddy had told her, every song Casey hummed, every piece of wisdom the old ones shared when they thought no young ears were listening. Mama Juba became her secret teacher, showing her which roots could heal and which could harm, which words had power when spoken at the right time, in the right way. Knowledge is the one thing they can't take from you, the old woman would say as they gathered herbs in the early morning mist. They can sell your body, beat your back, chain your feet, but what's in your head belongs to you alone. Emma soaked up that knowledge like dry earth drinks rain. She learned that willow bark could ease pain, that certain leaves steeped in water could bring down fever, that red clay mixed with spit could stop bleeding. But more than that, she learned the old ways. How to read signs in the flight of birds. How to feel trouble coming in the way the wind shifted. How to call on the ancestors when the living world became too heavy to bear. Most important of all, she learned when to show what she knew and when to keep it hidden. Around Morrison and the other white folks, she played the part of a simple field hand, eyes downcast, mouth shut, moving through her tasks like she was sleepwalking. But in the quarters, especially on Sunday evenings, when the work was done, and the overseers were drunk on whiskey and their own importance, Emma would sit with the elders and listen to the real education. Old Uncle Jeremiah, bent double from 50 years in the cotton fields, would tell stories that weren't quite stories. Tales about clever rabbits who outwitted hungry foxes, about wise tortoises who knew secret paths through dangerous territory, about birds who carried messages between the living and the dead. The children would laugh and clap, thinking they were hearing entertainment. But Emma understood that every tale carried instruction. Every character represented somebody in their world. Every plot twist taught survival. The rabbit, Uncle Jeremiah would say, his clouded eyes twinkling with mischief. He ain't stronger than the fox, and he sure ain't meaner. But he's got something the fox don't have. He knows when to run, when to hide, and when to turn the fox's own tricks against him. Sometimes being small and quick beats being big and cruel. Emma filed away every lesson, every warning, every whispered piece of advice. She learned that rebellion didn't always look like fire and bloodshed. Sometimes it looked like moving slow when Morrison wasn't watching, like accidentally dropping his tools in the creek, like singing coded songs that carried messages from cabin to cabin without a single suspicious word. She watched, and she listened, and she remembered everything. When young Sarah tried to run and was brought back with dog bites on her legs, Emma remembered. When old Moses collapsed in the fields and Morrison made him work anyway until he died with his face in the dirt, Emma remembered. When her brother Samuel got sold for talking back to the master's son, Emma remembered. Each injustice, each cruelty, each casual act of dehumanization got added to the inventory she was keeping in her heart. And with each addition, something inside her grew harder and sharper, like iron being forged in fire. She never spoke of it, never let it show in her face or her voice, but the rage was there, burning slow and steady as a banked coal, waiting for the day when it might finally catch flame. By 15, Emma had become exactly what the plantation system wanted. A quiet, obedient worker who could pick her quota, follow orders, and cause no trouble. Morrison barely noticed her anymore. which was exactly what she'd been hoping for. To him, she was just another piece of property, valuable only for the cotton she could harvest and the children she might eventually bear to increase his master's wealth. But underneath that perfect facade, Emma was something else entirely. She was a student of survival, a keeper of secrets, a repository of rage. She was the daughter of Kwame the storyteller and Casey the root doctor, raised on the milk of rebellion and weaned on the bitter truth that freedom was something you had to take, never something you'd be given. And though she didn't know it yet, she was also something more dangerous than any master could imagine. She was a woman who'd learned to hide her true self so well that when the mask finally came off, the face underneath would be terrible to behold. The first time Emma saw Morrison use his whip like he was conducting a symphony of screams, she was 11 years old and still believed that maybe, just maybe, if you were good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, you might avoid the worst of what this world had to offer. That belief died the day he turned Samuel Jenkins into a lesson nobody in the quarters would ever forget. Morrison stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry all the hate in Georgia, and he wore his cruelty like other men wore their Sunday best, with pride and attention to detail. His whip was a thing of beauty, if beauty could be measured in pain. 9 feet of braided leather with a cracker at the end that could take the hide off a man at 20 paces. He called it Sweet Susanna, like it was his wife or his lover, and he kept it oiled and supple as a dancer's spine. A whip, he'd say to the new overseers who came to learn his methods, ain't just a tool for punishment. It's a language all its own, one that speaks directly to the animal brain that lives underneath all that human pretense. You got to make each stroke count, make it sing the right song. Emma learned Morrison's songs by heart, though she never wanted to. There was the quick snap, snap, snap for minor infractions. Talking back, moving too slow, spilling something that shouldn't be spilled. That song usually ended with welts and tears, but no permanent damage. Then there was the steady rhythm for more serious crimes. Stealing food, trying to learn letters, getting caught with someone you weren't supposed to be with. That tune left scars that would last a lifetime. But the song Morrison played the day Samuel Jenkins got caught with a book was something else entirely. It was a composition written in flesh and blood, performed for an audience of terrified slaves who were forced to watch and learn what happened to those who reached beyond their station. Samuel was 17 and sharp as a new blade, with eyes that always seemed to be seeing further than they should. He'd been teaching himself to read, using a Bible he'd found buried under the floorboards of the old preacher's cabin, and he'd gotten good enough to make out whole sentences, not good enough to avoid getting caught by Morrison's boy Luke, who found him late one night, hunched over the pages by candlelight. The trial was a joke, the kind of theater masters loved to perform when they wanted to remind their property who held the power of life and death. Master Thornfield sat in his white-painted chair while Morrison presented the evidence. One worn Bible, one scared boy, one clear violation of the laws that kept the plantation running smooth. Reading makes them uppity, Morrison explained to his audience of forced witnesses. Makes them think they're equal to white folks. Makes them dream dreams that ain't meant for their kind. Can't have that spreadin', now can we? The whipping post stood ready like an altar to Morrison's particular brand of worship. Samuel was stripped to the waist and tied with his arms stretched high, his back exposed to the morning sun and whatever Morrison had planned for it. The entire slave population of Magnolia Grove was assembled in a half-circle around the post, children clutching their mothers' skirts, old folks praying under their breath, everyone knowing they were about to witness something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Morrison took his time, the way a preacher might take his time before delivering the sermon that would save souls or damn them. He ran his hands along Sweet Susanna's length, checking the braiding, testing the weight, getting himself in the proper frame of mind for the work ahead. 50 lashes, he announced, his voice carrying across the silent assembly like thunder before a storm. 50 lashes for the crime of reaching above your station. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks knowledge is meant for nigger hands. The first blow landed with a sound like a gunshot, and Samuel's body jerked against the ropes like he'd been struck by lightning. A thin line of red appeared across his shoulders, beading with blood that caught the morning light. Emma stood with her mother in the crowd, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms, watching Morrison settle into his rhythm. Each stroke was placed with surgical precision, the overseer's arm rising and falling like a machine designed for maximum suffering. Morrison wasn't just whipping Samuel. He was painting a masterpiece of agony across the young man's back, each line carefully placed to avoid any vital organs while maximizing pain. The sound of leather meeting flesh echoed off the plantation buildings, accompanied by Samuel's gasps and the quiet sobbing of his mother. By the 20th lash, Samuel's back looked like raw meat left out in the sun. By the 30th, he'd stopped making sounds altogether, his body hanging limp against the post like a broken marionette. But Morrison kept going, kept counting, kept teaching his lesson in the language of violence that he spoke so fluently. Emma watched every second of it, forced herself to memorize every detail, every expression that crossed Morrison's face as he worked. She saw the concentration, the professional pride, the genuine pleasure he took in breaking another human being down to nothing. She saw how the other white folks nodded approval, how Master Thornfield smiled like he was watching a particularly entertaining performance. Most of all, she saw how the system worked, not just through the whip, but through the watching. Every slave who witnessed Samuel's destruction was meant to carry that image back to the quarters, to share it in whispers that would spread the fear like infection. The beating itself was just the beginning. The real punishment was the knowledge that it could happen to anyone, any time, for any reason the masters deemed sufficient. When it was over, when Morrison finally coiled Sweet Susanna and walked away whistling like he'd just finished a pleasant morning's work, Samuel was cut down and carried to the infirmary. He lived, though he was never quite the same afterward. The scars on his back healed into thick ridges that pulled and ached in cold weather, but the deeper wounds, the ones to his spirit, never properly mended. That night, lying on her straw mattress with the sound of Samuel's screaming still echoing in her ears, Emma made herself a promise that nobody else would ever hear. Someday, somehow, she would make Morrison pay for every blow he'd delivered, every spirit he'd broken, every dream he'd crushed under his boot heel. She didn't know how or when, but she knew with certainty that accounts would be settled. The whip had taught its lesson well. But Emma had learned something Morrison never intended to teach. She'd learned that cruelty could be turned around, that weapons could change hands, and that someday the one holding sweet Susanna might be the one receiving her kiss instead of delivering it. 20 years had passed since that first whippin' Emma witnessed. 20 years of keeping her head down and her rage buried so deep it felt like a coal mine burning in her chest. She was 31 now, still strong as ironwood, but carrying the weight of every injustice she'd ever seen. Her hands were scarred from cotton thorns and kitchen burns. Her back ached from bending over endless rows of white gold. But her spirit, Lord have mercy, her spirit was still intact. That October morning started like any other morning had for 2 decades. The horn blew before dawn, calling the quarters to life like Gabriel's trumpet. On Judgment Day, Emma rolled off her straw pallet, her joints complaining about the cold that had crept through the cabin walls during the night. Her Mama Kessie was long dead, taken by fever 5 winters past, and Emma slept alone now in the cabin that had once held her whole family. She moved through her morning routine like clockwork. Splash of cold water on her face from the bucket by the door. Check the fire to see if any coals survived the night. Pull on her work dress that was more patches than original cloth. Outside, she could hear the shuffle of feet and the quiet murmur of voices as the other slaves emerged from their quarters, preparing for another day of making their masters rich. The cotton was ready for harvest, fields stretching out white as far as the eye could see under the autumn sky. Emma had been picking cotton since she was old enough to drag a sack behind her, and she could read the plants like other folks read newspapers. This was going to be a good year for Master Thornfield. The bolls were fat and full. The weather had been kind, and cotton prices in Savannah were higher than they'd been in years, which meant longer days, heavier quotas, and Morrison pushing everybody harder than usual. The overseer was getting old, past 50 now, with gray streaks in his hair and lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun. But his arm was still strong, and his disposition was meaner than ever. Age had curdled whatever humanity he might have once possessed, turning him into something that existed purely to extract labor and inflict pain. Emma had learned to be invisible around Morrison, to blend into the background like smoke or shadow. She picked her quota every day, never more and never less, spoke only when spoken to, and moved through her tasks with the kind of efficiency that drew no attention. For 20 years, this strategy had kept her off the whipping post and out of Morrison's particular notice. But that Tuesday morning, everything went wrong at once. It started with the fever. Emma had been fighting it for 3 days, the kind of bone-deep sickness that made every step feel like walking through molasses. She dosed herself with willow bark tea and whatever roots Mama Juba had left her before she passed, but the fever clung to her like a jealous lover, making her head swim and her hands shake. Pride kept her from admitting she was sick. 6 slaves got sold or worse. Master Thornfield had no patience for property that couldn't earn its keep. So Emma dragged herself to the fields that morning, her cotton sack tied around her waist, her hands already cramping from the anticipation of the work ahead. The sun climbed higher, beaten down on the fields like the wrath of an angry god. Emma's fever made everything seem too bright, too loud, too close. The voices of the other pickers sounded like they were coming from underwater, and the white cotton bolls seemed to shimmer and dance before her eyes like spirits mocking her weakness. She should have been able to pick 200 pounds by dinner time. That was her quota, the amount that kept Morrison's attention focused elsewhere. But the fever had slowed her hands, made her clumsy, caused her to drop bowls that she'd already picked. By noon, her sack was barely half full, and panic was starting to creep up her spine like cold fingers. "Move faster, you lazy bitch!" The voice cut through the afternoon heat like a whip crack. Morrison had appeared beside her row without warning, his face red from sun and anger, his eyes locked on her pathetically light sack. "What you think this is, a goddamn vacation?" Emma tried to explain, tried to find words that might save her without admitting weakness. "Sir, I've been picking steady all morning. Cotton's just... the bowls are smaller today." The lie died in her throat when she saw Morrison's expression change. She'd broken the first rule of survival. Never make excuses. Never give reasons. Never suggest that the fault lay anywhere but with your own inadequacy. Morrison's hand was already moving toward his whip, his fingers caressing the braided leather like a lover's touch. "Smaller bowls?" His voice was soft, deadly. "You sayin' Master Thornfield's cotton ain't good enough for your nigger hands? You sayin' there's something wrong with this crop that's gonna make us all rich?" Emma realized her mistake too late. In her fever-addled state, she'd suggested that the plantation might be at fault for her poor performance. That was heresy of the highest order, the kind of uppity thinking that Morrison lived to beat out of his charges. "No, sir," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean, I was just—" But Morrison wasn't listening anymore. His decision was made, written in the cruel smile that spread across his weather-beaten face. He'd been having a bad week. Cotton prices were good, but not as good as he'd promised, and Master Thornfield had been asking uncomfortable questions about productivity. Morrison needed someone to blame, someone to make an example of, and Emma had just volunteered herself. 600 lashes, he said, his voice carrying across the field like a death sentence. For laziness, for lying, and for having the gall to blame her betters for her own failings. Y'all gather around now, here. Time for another lesson in what happens to uppity niggers who forget their place. Emma felt the world tilt sideways, felt her knees buckle like they were made of water instead of bone. 600 lashes. She'd never heard of anyone surviving more than 100. Never seen a back that could take that kind of punishment and still keep breathing. Morrison wasn't planning to teach her a lesson. He was planning to kill her slow, to make her death into entertainment for the other slaves, and a warning that would echo through the quarters for generations. As the field hands gathered around, their faces painted with horror and helpless sympathy, Emma found herself thinking about her daddy's last words to her all those years ago. "Remember who you are," he'd said. "Remember your name." Emma, not the broken field hand Morrison saw, not the piece of property Master Thornfield owned, but Emma, daughter of Kwame and Kisi, keeper of stories, holder of secrets, carrier of rage that had been burning for 31 years. If she was gonna die today, she was gonna die as herself, not as the mask she'd worn for so long she'd almost forgotten what lay underneath. Morrison was already uncoiling his whip, already preparing for the performance of his lifetime. But as Emma walked toward the post where she would be tied, she felt something stirring in her chest. Not fear, not resignation, but something else entirely. Something that had been waiting 20 years for its moment to emerge. Something that felt like lightning gathering before the storm. The whipping post stood in the center of the field like an ancient tree rooted in suffering, its surface worn smooth by the desperate grip of countless hands, its base dark with blood that had soaked so deep into the Georgia clay it had become part of the earth itself. Emma walked toward it with the steady gait of someone marching to their own funeral, while behind her, the field hands formed a circle of witnesses, some crying quiet tears, others praying under their breath, all of them knowing they were about to watch a murder dressed up as justice. Morrison followed her, sweet Susanna coiled in his hand like a sleeping serpent, his face bright with anticipation. He'd been overseer at Magnolia Grove for 23 years, and in all that time, he'd never ordered a punishment quite this severe. 600 lashes was more than discipline. It was execution by installment, death stretched out over hours to maximize both suffering and spectacle. "Tie her up good," Morrison called to his driver, a broken-spirited man named Caesar, who'd learned long ago that survival meant doing whatever the white man commanded, no matter how it tore at his soul. Arms stretched high, feet spread wide. I want her to feel every stroke clean down to her bones. Emma stood still as Caesar bound her wrists with rope that had been softened by too much use, too much blood. The post felt warm against her chest, heated by the afternoon sun and the fever that still burned through her veins. Around her, the assembled slaves shuffled their feet and whispered prayers, creating a low murmur that sounded like wind through cemetery grass. Master Thornfield arrived in his carriage just as the preparations were completed, his pale face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, his soft hands folded across his considerable belly. He'd come to watch the show, to see his property disciplined properly, to remind himself of the absolute power he held over the lives and deaths of 200 human souls. Magnificent day for it, he commented to Morrison, as if they were discussing the weather or the cotton crop instead of planned torture. Nothing quite like a proper whipping to restore order when the niggers get too comfortable. You may proceed, Morrison. Make it memorable. Morrison nodded, his chest swelling with professional pride. He stepped back from the post, measuring the distance with the eye of a craftsman, then let sweet Susanna uncoil to her full length. The leather whispered against the ground like something alive, something hungry for the taste of flesh. 600 lashes for Emma, Morrison announced in his preacher's voice, the one he used for formal occasions. For laziness in the fields, for lies told to her betters, and for the sin of pride that makes niggers think they're equal to white folk. Let this be a lesson to all y'all about what happens when you forget your place. He raised his arm, the whip curling behind him like a question mark drawn in shadow. Emma closed her eyes and tried to remember her daddy's stories, tried to find some scrap of strength in the memories he'd left her. But all she could think about was the mathematics of her situation. 600 lashes at maybe 10 seconds between each stroke meant an hour and 40 minutes of agony, assuming Morrison maintained his usual pace. Assuming she lived long enough for him to finish counting, the first blow landed across her shoulders with the force of a sledgehammer, and Emma's world exploded into white-hot pain that ran from the point of impact all the way down to her toes. The breath rushed out of her lungs in a sound that was half scream, half prayer, and her body jerked against the ropes hard enough to tear the skin on her wrists. 1, Morrison called out cheerfully, like he was counting dance steps at a wedding. 599 to go. The second lash crossed the first at an angle, creating an X of fire across Emma's back. The third opened the skin completely, sending blood trickling down her spine in warm rivulets. By the fifth stroke, Morrison had settled into his rhythm, his arm rising and falling with mechanical precision, each blow placed with the care of a surgeon making an incision. Emma bit through her tongue to keep from screaming, tasted blood and copper, and the salt of tears she refused to shed in front of these people. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything she'd ever imagined possible. It felt like being skinned alive, like having molten metal poured over her back, like every nerve in her body was being twisted with red-hot pliers. But worse than the physical agony was the humiliation. The knowledge that she was being reduced to nothing more than entertainment for white folks who saw her suffering as proof of their own superiority. She could hear Master Thornfield making approving comments, could sense the mixture of horror and morbid fascination radiating from the other slaves, could feel Morrison's satisfaction with each perfectly placed stroke. By the 50th lash, Emma's back was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed muscle, blood running down her legs to pool in the red clay at her feet. Her vision had gone dark around the edges, her consciousness flickering like a candle in a hurricane. But still, Morrison continued. Still, the count climbed higher. Still, the whip sang its song of absolute power. 100, Morrison called, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. How you feeling now, girl? Ready to apologize for your laziness? Ready to beg forgiveness from your betters? Emma tried to speak, tried to form words around the blood in her mouth, but nothing came out except a low moan that sounded like wind through broken trees. Morrison laughed and raised his arm again, the whip coiling behind him like a threat made flesh. I'll take that as a no, he said. 500 more to teach you proper respect. As the lash fell again, Emma felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, but something else. Something that had been holding her together for 31 years. It was the careful construction she'd built to survive, the mask of obedience and submission that had kept her alive in this world of chains and cotton. Behind that breaking, underneath all the pain and humiliation and fear, something else stirred. Something that had been waiting in the dark corners of her soul since the day they sold her daddy, since the night Samuel Jenkins was whipped for learning to read, since the first time she'd seen Morrison smile while causing pain. It was rage, pure and clean as lightning, older than her years and deeper than the Middle Passage. It was the accumulated fury of 10 generations of enslaved ancestors, the righteous anger of every mother who'd watched her children sold, every father who'd died in chains, every soul who'd been reduced to property in the ledger books of white men. And as Morrison's whip continued to fall, as the count climbed toward 200 and then beyond, that rage began to burn away the fever. Burn away the pain, burn away everything except the crystal clear understanding that this moment, this exact moment, was when everything would change. Emma lifted her head, blood dripping from her lips, and stared directly into Morrison's eyes. What he saw there made him stumble in his rhythm, made his next stroke fall wide of its mark, because Emma wasn't looking at him like a victim anymore. She was looking at him like prey. The count had reached 347 when Emma felt the ancestors arrive. They came like a tide of whispers, like the rustle of leaves in a wind that nobody else could feel. First was her daddy, Kwame, his voice steady as river stones. "Remember who you are, little bird. Remember your name." Then her mama Casey, humming the old songs that carried power from across the water. Behind them came voices she'd never heard, but somehow knew. Great-grandmothers who'd survived the Middle Passage. Great-grandfathers who'd died with defiance on their lips. Babies who'd been sold before they could walk. All of them gathering around the whipping post like witnesses to a trial that had been 20 generations in the making. Emma's body was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone. Her back opened up like a butcher's work, her blood mixing with the red Georgia clay until she couldn't tell where she ended and the earth began. She should have been dead by now, would have been if she'd been any other woman. But the ancestors were holding her up, breathing strength into her lungs, keeping her heart beating when it should have stopped. Morrison was tiring, his arm burning from the repetitive motion, his shirt soaked with sweat from the effort of maintaining his brutal rhythm. Sweet Susanna was slick with blood, making his grip uncertain, and twice he'd had to pause to wipe his hands on his pants before continuing. The audience was growing restless too. Even the other slaves were looking sick, and Master Thornfield had retreated to the shade of his carriage, his pale face green around the edges. 400! Morrison called out, though his voice lacked the enthusiasm it had carried at the beginning. This was taking longer than he'd planned, requiring more effort than he'd anticipated. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, and there were still 200 lashes to go. That's when Emma spoke for the first time since the beating began. "You. Getting tired, Morrison?" Her voice was hoarse, broken by screaming and blood, but it carried across the field clear as a church bell. The overseer paused with his arm raised, staring at her in disbelief. In 23 years of whipping slaves, he'd never had one mock him during their punishment. "What did you say, girl?" Emma lifted her head, and when Morrison saw her face, he took an involuntary step backward. Her eyes were wrong somehow, not broken like they should have been, not pleading for mercy like every other slave who'd been tied to this post. They were bright as stars, burning with something that made his skin crawl. "I said—" Emma's voice grew stronger, drawing power from sources Morrison couldn't understand. "You getting tired, white man? Your arm getting heavy? Sweet Susanna not singing as pretty as she used to?" The assembled slaves gasped, some covering their mouths in horror at such open defiance. Master Thornfield lurched forward in his carriage, his face flushed with rage. "Silence that bitch!" he shouted. "Beat the words right out of her mouth." Morrison raised his whip with both hands, putting his full weight behind the blow. But as Sweet Susanna whistled through the air toward Emma's already destroyed back, something impossible happened. Emma moved. Not much, just a slight shift of her shoulders, a barely perceptible twist of her torso. But it was enough to make the whip's path change by inches. enough to send the leather cracker snapping harmlessly past her ear instead of biting into her flesh. The watching slaves murmured in confusion, unsure of what they'd just seen. Morrison stared at his whip, then at Emma, then back at his whip. In all his years of beating people, he'd never missed a stationary target, never even come close to missing. "Hold still, goddammit," he snarled, raising his arm again. "Why?" Emma asked, and now her voice carried something that made every person in that field feel cold, despite the Georgia heat. "You scared you might miss again?" This time Morrison put everything he had into the stroke, his arm whipping forward with vicious precision. But again, impossibly, Emma shifted just enough to make him miss, the whip cracking empty air while she hung from the post like she was dancing to music only she could hear. "What the hell?" Morrison breathed, his confidence starting to crack. Emma laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was like nothing anyone in that field had ever heard before. It wasn't the laughter of a broken woman or a mad woman. It was the laughter of someone who'd just realized they'd been holding back their whole life, someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be weak. 20 years, she said, her voice carrying across the field like thunder before a storm. 20 years, I've been watching you wave that whip around like you're conducting some kind of orchestra. You know what I learned, Morrison? I learned your rhythm. I learned your tells. I learned when you're going to strike and where you're going to aim. Morrison's face had gone white as cotton, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling afternoon air. Around him, the other slaves were pressing closer, sensing that something unprecedented was happening, but not yet daring to believe what their eyes were telling them. I learned something else too, Emma continued, and now her voice was rising, gaining power with every word. I learned that a whip is just a tool, and tools, well, tools can change hands. She moved then, faster than thought, faster than fear. Her arms, which should have been too damaged to function, her shoulders, which should have been destroyed by 347 lashes, her hands, which should have been numb with pain. All of them moved with precision, born from 20 years of watching, 20 years of planning, 20 years of rage distilled into a single moment of perfect action. Emma twisted in her bonds, using the post itself as leverage, and as Morrison's next blow fell, she caught Sweet Susanna's leather length in her right hand. The cracker wrapped around her wrist like a bracelet, and for a heartbeat, woman and overseer were connected by 9 feet of braided leather, staring at each other across a distance that might as well have been the space between stars. Morrison tugged, trying to pull his whip free, but Emma held on with strength that shouldn't have existed in her mangled body. She smiled then, and it was the most terrible smile anyone in that field would ever see. The smile of 20 years of buried rage finally finding its voice. "My turn," she whispered, and with a movement that defied physics, that broke every law of bondage and submission, Emma jerked hard on the whip. Morrison, caught off balance, stumbled forward into range of her feet. Her kick caught him square in the chest, sending him staggering backward with his eyes wide in shock and disbelief. Sweet Susanna fell from his nerveless fingers into the red clay, its leather length coiling like a snake that had finally found a new master. Emma looked down at the whip, then at Morrison, then at the circle of witnesses who were watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. 20 years, she said again, louder now, her voice carrying to every corner of the field. 20 years I've been learning your lessons, Morrison. Now it's time for your education to begin. The moment Emma's bare feet touched that bloody Georgia clay with sweet Susanna coiled in her hands like a promise of vengeance, the very air around Magnolia Grove seemed to hold its breath. Time moved different in that space, between heartbeats, stretched out like molasses in winter, and Emma found herself standing in two worlds at once. The world of whips and chains, where she'd lived for 31 years, and another world entirely, a place where the spirits of the Middle Passage gathered to witness justice finally finding its voice. She could see them all now, clear as daylight despite the gathering dusk. Her daddy Kwame stood to her right, his massive frame no longer bent by cotton sacks and sorrow, his eyes bright with pride and terrible purpose. Behind him stretched an endless line of ancestors, men and women who'd been stolen from African soil, children who'd died in shipholds, elders who'd been worked to death in rice fields and sugarcane plantations. All of them watching, all of them waiting, all of them lending their strength to this one moment that had been building for centuries. You remember now, little bird. Kwame's voice whispered in her ear, though his lips never moved. You remember who you really are. And Emma did remember, not just her name, not just her daddy's stories, but everything, every slight, every injustice, every moment of casual cruelty that had been heaped upon her people since the first slave ship crossed the Atlantic. The memories weren't hers alone anymore. They belonged to all the ancestors, flowing through her like river water, seeking the sea. She remembered Ayaba, who'd thrown herself from a slave ship rather than live in chains. She remembered Cudjoe, who'd fought off hunting parties in the Carolina swamps for 20 years before they finally brought him down. She remembered nameless women who'd killed their own children rather than see them sold. Nameless men who'd died with rebellion on their lips. Nameless souls who'd found ways to resist even when resistance seemed impossible. All of that history, all of that accumulated rage and sorrow and stubborn hope flowed into Emma's ruined body like lightning seeking ground. Her wounds stopped bleeding. Her strength returned tenfold. And when she raised her eyes to look at Morrison, the overseer saw something that made his bowels turn to water. He saw the judgment of generations written in her face. This ain't possible, Morrison whispered, backing away from the whipping post like a man retreating from a hungry lion. You're just a nigger girl. Your property, you can't. This can't? Emma smiled, and it was the smile of every slave who'd ever dreamed of turning the tables on their masters. Can't what, Morrison? Can't stand up? Can't fight back? Can't make you taste your own medicine? She took a step forward, sweet Susanna trailing behind her like a faithful serpent, and Morrison took 2 steps back. Around them, the circle of witnesses pressed closer, slaves and masters alike mesmerized by the impossible sight of a beaten woman walking free, while her tormentor cowered before her. 20 years, Emma said again, her voice carrying across the field like the call of a war drum. 20 years, I watched you break spirits, destroy families, turn human beings into work animals. 20 years, I listened to you preach about knowing our place, about accepting our lot, about being grateful for the privilege of making you rich with our blood and sweat. Morrison's hand moved toward the pistol he wore on his hip, but his fingers were shaking so badly he couldn't get a proper grip on the weapon. The other white folks who'd come to watch the entertainment were backing away too, suddenly remembering that they were vastly outnumbered by the very people they'd been oppressing. "You know what I learned in all that time?" Emma continued, advancing on Morrison with the patience of a predator who knows her prey has nowhere to run. "I learned that fear is like fire. It only burns as long as you keep feeding it. Stop feeding it, and it dies out quick enough." She raised Sweet Susanna, testing the whip's weight and balance like a craftsman examining a familiar tool. The leather felt alive in her hands, eager to sing a different song than it had been trained to perform. Morrison whimpered and fell to his knees, his courage finally deserting him completely. "Please," he gasped, his voice breaking like a boy's instead of a man's. "Please, I was just doing my job. I was following orders. I never meant. I was just—" Emma paused, tilting her head to study him with the detached curiosity of someone examining an interesting insect. "Just what, Morrison? Just following orders? Just doing what you were told? Just making a living off human misery?" The watching slaves were pressing closer now, their fear giving way to wonder, and then to something more dangerous: hope. For the first time in their lives, they were seeing one of their own standing over a white man, holding the whip that had terrorized them for so long. The impossible was happening right before their eyes, and they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. Master Thornfield was screaming orders from his carriage, demanding that someone restore order, that someone put down this uppity slave before she gave the others ideas. But his words fell on deaf ears. The drivers and overseers who might have intervened were frozen in place, uncertain how to respond to something that had never happened before in the history of the plantation. Emma raised Sweet Susanna high above her head, and the assembled crowd fell silent as death. Morrison closed his eyes and began to pray, his lips moving soundlessly as he prepared for the judgment he'd earned through 23 years of casual cruelty. "You want to know what the difference is between me and you?" Emma asked, her voice soft as silk and twice as deadly. "You beat people because you like it. You take pleasure in causing pain, in breaking spirits, in reducing human beings to nothing more than animals. You do it because it makes you feel powerful, because it feeds something sick and hungry inside you." She brought the whip down with a crack that echoed like thunder across the field. But at the last second, she pulled her aim, sending Sweet Susanna snapping into the dirt inches from Morrison's trembling form. "But I ain't you," Emma said, lowering the whip to her side. "I ain't gonna beat a man just because I can. That's the difference between a human being and a monster, Morrison. That's the difference between justice and revenge." Morrison opened his eyes, hardly daring to believe he was still alive. Around him, the slaves murmured in confusion and disappointment. They'd wanted to see blood, wanted to watch their tormentor receive some measure of what he'd dealt out over the years. Emma looked around the circle of faces, black and white, slave and free, all of them staring at her like she was something out of legend. And maybe she was. Maybe this moment would be remembered and retold until it became myth, until the truth got polished smooth, by countless retellings. "But that don't mean," she said, turning back to Morrison with eyes that burned like coals, "that you're gonna walk away from this unchanged." Quick as lightning, she grabbed the overseer by his hair and jerked his head back, exposing his throat to sweet Susanna's kiss. For a moment, the whip's leather length pressed against Morrison's neck like a promise of death, and Emma could feel the ancestors urging her to finish what centuries of oppression had started. But instead, she leaned close to Morrison's ear and whispered words that only he could hear, words that carried the weight of prophecy and the certainty of doom. When she released him, Morrison collapsed completely, sobbing like a broken child, his spirit shattered as thoroughly as he'd shattered so many others. Emma stood over him for a moment longer, then dropped sweet Susanna into the bloody clay and walked away, leaving Morrison to contemplate the ruins of his world and the knowledge that he would never again feel safe in his own skin. The revolution had begun with mercy, but mercy that carried its own terrible price. The silence that followed Emma's words stretched out like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that nobody in that blood-soaked field quite knew how to name. Morrison lay curled in the red clay like a broken toy, his sobs the only sound in a world that had suddenly turned upside down and inside out. The whip lay beside him, abandoned, its leather coils already being reclaimed by the Georgia earth that had drunk so much suffering over the years. Emma stood in the center of it all, naked from the waist up, her back a canvas of destruction that should have killed her 3 times over, but somehow still breathing, still standing, still radiating the kind of power that made grown men step backward without thinking. The ancestors were still with her. She could feel them pressing close like a crowd of witnesses at a trial, their voices whispering encouragement and warnings in equal measure. What happens now? The question came from young Marcus, Samuel Jenkins' boy, who'd grown up hearing stories about his father's beating and dreaming of the day someone might finally turn the tables on their oppressors. His voice cracked with the weight of hope and terror, because he understood better than most that what they'd just witnessed couldn't be undone, couldn't be forgotten, couldn't be explained away as anything other than open rebellion. Emma looked at him, then at the circle of slaves pressing closer despite their fear, their faces painted with wonder and desperate longing. These were her people, the ones who'd shared her suffering, who'd watched their children sold and their loved ones whipped, and their spirits ground down day after day until they'd almost forgotten what hope felt like. Now they were looking at her like she might have answers, like she might be the Moses their grandmothers had prayed for in the hush harbors. But Emma knew better than to promise what she couldn't deliver. Freedom wasn't something that came from one moment of defiance, no matter how dramatic. It was something that had to be fought for, bled for, died for, if necessary. And the price of what she'd just done would be paid in blood before the sun set on another day. "What happens now?" she said, her voice carrying across the field like a judgment pronounced from on high. "Is we remember who we are. We remember that we're human beings, not animals. We remember that our children deserve better than chains and whips and being sold like cattle. We remember that freedom is something worth dying for." Master Thornfield chose that moment to find his courage, or at least enough of it, to climb down from his carriage and point a shaking finger at Emma like he was pronouncing a curse. "Seize that slave!" he screamed, his voice high and thin with panic. "Seize her and string her up! This is insurrection! This is rebellion! This cannot be allowed to stand!" But nobody moved to obey him. The white overseers and drivers were still too stunned by what they'd witnessed, too uncertain about how to handle a situation that had no precedent in their experience. The slaves, meanwhile, were looking back and forth between their masters and Emma, feeling the first stirrings of something they'd almost forgotten existed. Choice. Emma saw the hesitation, saw the moment balanced on a knife's edge between submission and revolution, and she knew that what happened next would echo through generations. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, could hear the voices of ancestors urging her forward into whatever darkness lay ahead. "Look at him," she said, pointing at Morrison's broken form. "Look at the man who's terrorized us for 20 years, reduced to sobbing in the dirt like a whipped child. Look at Master Thornfield, hiding behind his carriage and screaming orders that nobody's following. Look at them and tell me, what exactly makes them better than us? What gives them the right to own us, beat us, sell us like we're no more valuable than livestock?" The questions hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch, and Emma could see them taking root in minds that had been trained from birth to accept their own inferiority. Dangerous questions, the kind that led to dangerous thoughts, the kind that made slaves remember they were human beings with human rights that no law could truly take away. "The color of their skin," Emma continued, her voice rising with each word. "The accidents of their birth, the fact that their grandfathers stole our grandfathers from Africa and called it commerce. What law of God or nature says that melanin determines worth, that ancestry determines destiny?" Master Thornfield was backing toward his carriage now, his face pale as parchment, finally understanding that he was witnessing something that couldn't be controlled or contained. This wasn't just one slave having a moment of defiance. This was the first crack in a dam that had been holding back an ocean of rage and resentment for centuries. "Stop her!" he screamed at his overseers. "Somebody stop her before she fills their heads with more poison." But Emma was just getting started. She could feel the power flowing through her, the accumulated strength of every ancestor who'd died dreaming of freedom, every parent who'd whispered hope into their children's ears, every soul who'd found ways to resist, even when resistance meant death. "You know what I learned hanging on that whipping post?" she called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the plantation. "I learned that pain is just pain. It hurts, but it passes. Fear is just fear. It's powerful, but it's not real. The only thing that's real is what we choose to do with the time we're given, the courage we find to stand up for what's right." Around her, she could see the change happening in real time. Backs were straightening, eyes were lifting, hands that had been trained to hang submissively at their sides were slowly clenching into fists. The slaves were remembering something they'd been forced to forget, that they were people, not property, and people had the right to fight for their freedom. Old Mama Juba stepped forward then, her ancient frame moving with surprising grace. her clouded eyes fixed on Emma with something that might have been pride or prophecy, or both. She'd delivered Emma into this world 31 years ago, had taught her the old ways, the secret knowledge that connected them to ancestors and traditions that slavery couldn't touch. Now, she was witnessing the fulfillment of something she'd seen in the young woman's eyes from the very beginning. "Child," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of survival and resistance. "You speak truth that's been waiting a long time to be heard. But truth is a dangerous thing in a world built on lies. You ready for what comes next?" Emma looked at the old woman, who'd been like a grandmother to her, saw the love and worry warring in those ancient features, and felt the full weight of what she was choosing settle on her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. What came next would be violence, she knew. Blood and fire and death, because men like Thornfield and Morrison would never willingly give up the power they'd built on other people's suffering. But she also knew that some things were worth dying for, and the chance to break chains that had bound her people for generations was one of them. "I'm ready, Mama Juba," she said, and her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd finally found her purpose. "Been ready my whole life, just didn't know it yet." The old woman nodded and stepped back, melting into the crowd of slaves who were now pressing close enough to touch Emma, to feel the heat radiating from her wounded body, to convince themselves that what they were seeing was real and not just another dream of freedom that would fade with the dawn. Emma looked around at all those faces, young and old, hopeful and terrified, eager and uncertain, and felt the full magnitude of what she'd unleashed. There was no going back now, no return to the careful survival that had sustained her for 30 years. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had spoken truths that couldn't be unspoken. The revolution had begun, and like all revolutions, it would demand everything from those who chose to join it. The transformation came not with thunder and lightning, but with the simple act of Emma reaching down and picking up sweet Susanna from the blood-soaked clay. The leather felt different in her hands now, not like a weapon of oppression, but like an instrument of justice finally finding its proper owner. The whip seemed to pulse with new purpose, as if 23 years of inflicting pain had been preparation for this single moment of righteous fury. Morrison was still on his knees, his mind shattered by Emma's whispered prophecy, when she turned her attention back to him. The overseer who'd ruled Magnolia Grove through fear and brutality was now just a broken man sobbing in the dirt. But Emma knew that mercy had its limits. Some lessons could only be taught with blood. Some debts could only be paid in pain. "Look at me, Morrison," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of judgment itself. He raised his head slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and streaming, and what he saw in Emma's face made him whimper like a beaten dog. This wasn't the submissive slave he'd tortured for 347 lashes. This was something else entirely. Something that had emerged from the crucible of suffering, transformed and terrible and utterly without mercy for those who'd shown none to others. 20 years, Emma said, letting sweet Susanna's length play out to its full 9 feet. 20 years of watching you break spirits and destroy families. 20 years of seeing you smile while children cried for parents you'd sold away. 20 years of keeping count of every injustice, every cruelty, every casual act of evil you called discipline. She began to circle him, the whip trailing behind her like a predator's tail, and Morrison's eyes followed her movement with the desperate attention of prey, trying to anticipate which direction death would come from. "You know what the difference is between you and me," Emma continued, her bare feet silent on the bloody ground. "You beat people because you enjoyed it. You took pleasure in reducing human beings to animals, in breaking spirits that were stronger than yours ever was. You did it because it fed something sick and twisted inside you." Morrison tried to speak, tried to form words of apology or explanation, but only incoherent sounds emerged from his throat. The capacity for language seemed to have deserted him, along with his courage. "But I ain't doing this for pleasure," Emma said, raising Sweet Susanna until its leather length caught the late afternoon sunlight. "I'm doing this for justice, for my daddy who was sold away when I was 6, for Samuel Jenkins who died a broken man after you whipped him for learning to read, for every child who grew up never knowing their parents because you separated families like they were livestock." The assembled slaves had fallen silent, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be remembered for generations. Even Master Thornfield had stopped screaming, recognizing with the survival instincts that had made his family rich that this moment was bigger than his authority, more dangerous than his power could contain. Emma drew her arm back with fluid grace, every muscle in her ruined body moving in perfect coordination, despite the damage Morrison's whip had inflicted. For 20 years, she'd watched him perform this same motion, had memorized every detail of his technique, had absorbed the precise timing and positioning that made Sweet Susanna sing her song of pain. "This is for every tear that was never allowed to fall," she said, and brought the whip down with supernatural precision. The crack when leather met flesh echoed across the plantation like a gunshot, and Morrison's scream shattered the afternoon silence into 1,000 pieces. The whip had laid open his back from shoulder blade to spine, blood immediately welling up in the furrow Emma had carved with surgical accuracy. 1, she counted, her voice steady as stone. 599 to go. Morrison collapsed forward, pressing his face into the dirt, his body convulsing with pain and shock. But Emma wasn't finished with him yet. She'd waited 20 years for this moment, had endured 347 lashes to earn this right, and she intended to collect every stroke that justice owed her people. The second blow crossed the first at a perfect angle, and Morrison's scream rose an octave higher. The third opened his flesh completely, sending blood streaming down his sides to pool in the red clay. By the 5th stroke, Emma had settled into the same mechanical rhythm Morrison had used on countless victims, each blow placed with the care of a master craftsman. 10, she announced. "You remember what 10 feels like, Morrison? That's about how many most slaves get for spilling something or moving too slow. We got 590 more to go." Around her, the watching slaves were beginning to murmur among themselves, their voices rising with each crack of the whip, their excitement building as they witnessed their tormentor receiving a taste of his own medicine. This was justice in its purest form. The tables finally turned after generations of oppression. But as Emma raised Sweet Susanna for the 11th stroke, something changed in the air around them. The ancestors who'd been lending her strength began to pull back, their voices growing fainter, their presence less immediate. Not because they disapproved of what she was doing, but because the next part of her journey was something she had to walk alone. "Enough," said a voice from the crowd, and Emma paused with her arm raised, looking for whoever had spoken. It was Mama Juba who stepped forward, her ancient eyes fixed on Emma with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Child, you proved your point. You shown these people that the mighty can fall and the lowly can rise. But if you keep going, if you beat that man to death in front of all these witnesses, then you become what he was. And that ain't who you are." Emma felt the truth of those words hit her like cold water, cutting through the rage that had sustained her through the worst beating in Magnolia Grove's history. She looked down at Morrison's ruined back, at the blood pooling around his broken form, and saw herself reflected in his suffering. "He deserves to die," she said quietly. "After everything he's done, all the pain he's caused, he deserves to feel every lash he ever gave." "Maybe he does," Mama Juba agreed. "But you don't deserve to become him. You don't deserve to carry that weight on your soul. You already done enough, child. You already changed everything." Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her. Slaves who were standing straighter than they had in years. White folks who were looking at their human property with new eyes. A world that had been turned upside down by one woman's refusal to stay broken. Slowly, she lowered sweet Susanna to her side. Morrison's breathing was labored but steady. He would live, though he would carry the scars of this encounter for the rest of his days. More importantly, he would carry the knowledge that he was no longer untouchable, no longer safe behind his white skin and his position of authority. "You're right, Mama Juba," Emma said, her voice carrying to every corner of the field. "I ain't him, and I ain't gonna become him. But I ain't finished yet either." She turned to face Master Thornfield, who was watching from beside his carriage, with the expression of a man seeing his entire world crumble around him. Sweet Susanna was still in her hands, still slick with Morrison's blood, still hungry for justice. "Your turn," she said simply, and the revolution moved into its next phase. Master Thornfield stood frozen beside his carriage, like a man watching his own execution, his pale face drained of all color, except for the red veins that mapped his terror across skin that had never known honest labor. For 47 years, he'd lived as king of his small empire, surrounded by human property that existed solely to make him rich, protected by laws that said his slaves were chattel, and his word was absolute. Now he was staring at the complete collapse of that world, embodied in a half-naked woman holding a bloody whip and looking at him like he was next on the auction block. Emma began walking toward him with the slow, measured pace of justice, finally catching up to a man who'd spent his entire life outrunning it. Sweet Susanna trailed behind her, leaving a thin line of Morrison's blood in the red clay, and with each step, the watching slaves felt something fundamental shift in the air around them. This wasn't just rebellion anymore. This was revolution, the kind that burned down old worlds to make room for new ones. "Now, Emma," Thornfield said, his voice shaking like autumn leaves. "Let's not do anything hasty here. I know you're upset about the whipping, but Morrison was just following established protocol. Perhaps we can work out some kind of arrangement." Emma paused in her advance. tilting her head like she was considering his words, with the same attention she'd give to a snake, trying to convince her it wasn't poisonous. Around them, the assembled slaves were pressing closer, their faces bright with anticipation, and something else. The dawning realization that they outnumbered their oppressors by more than 10 to 1, and that the only thing that had ever kept them in chains was their own acceptance of their powerlessness. "Arrangement?" Emma repeated, tasting the word like it was something bitter. "What kind of arrangement you thinking about, master? You gonna give me back my daddy? You gonna bring back all the children you sold away from their mothers? You gonna undo 23 years of Morrison's whip?" Thornfield's hands fluttered like dying birds as he searched for words that might save him. Behind him, his carriage driver, a free black man named Charles, who'd been purchased along with his freedom by Thornfield's father, sat rigid on his seat, his eyes fixed straight ahead like he was trying to pretend this conversation wasn't happening. "Money," Thornfield said desperately. "I can give you money. Freedom papers, safe passage north. Anything you want, just put down that whip and let's talk like civilized people." Emma laughed, and the sound carried across the field like wind through a graveyard. "Civilized? You want to talk about civilized? What's civilized about buying and selling human beings? What's civilized about separating families and working people to death in your cotton fields? What's civilized about 600 lashes for having the fever?" She was close enough now that Thornfield could see the wounds Morrison's whip had carved across her back, could see the blood that still seeped from flesh that should have killed her hours ago. But Emma was still standing, still strong, still radiating the kind of power that made grown men remember that money and law and custom were just human inventions that could be unmade as easily as they'd been created. "The truth is," Emma continued, raising Sweet Susanna until its leather length caught the dying sunlight, "you already made me an offer 20 years ago. You offered me a life of chains and whips and watching my people suffer while you got rich off our pain. I took that deal for 20 years, master. Now I'm ready to negotiate new terms." The whip came down with perfect precision, not across Thornfield's back, but across the ground between his feet, close enough to send dust spiraling up around his legs and make him stumble backward against his carriage. The crack echoed like thunder, and every person in that field felt the sound in their bones. "Strip," Emma commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to use power properly. Not as a tool for cruelty, but as an instrument of justice. "What?" Thornfield gasped, his hands clutching at his chest like his heart might leap out of his body. "You heard me. Take off your clothes, all of them. I want to see what 47 years of easy living looks like without all that fancy fabric to hide behind." The watching slaves began to murmur with excitement and disbelief. They'd never seen a white man humiliated before, never witnessed one of their masters reduced to the same vulnerability they'd lived with their entire lives. It was intoxicating and terrifying and absolutely necessary. I can't," Thornfield stammered, his face flushing red with shame and fear. "You can't?" Emma stepped closer, her eyes burning with the accumulated fury of every slave who'd ever been stripped naked and examined like livestock at market. "You can't do what? Feel what it's like to be exposed? To be vulnerable? To have your humanity questioned by someone who thinks they own you?" Sweet Susanna cracked again, this time close enough to Thornfield's ear that he could feel the wind from its passage. His hands moved to his shirt with trembling fingers, and slowly, piece by piece, he began to undress under the watchful eyes of people he'd never considered fully human. When he stood naked and shivering in the Georgia twilight, his pale flesh marked with nothing more dangerous than the soft living of a man who'd never done honest work, Emma circled him like a buyer, examining potential property. The slaves watching began to call out observations. Comments about his soft hands, his round belly, his complete lack of scars or calluses, or any sign that he'd ever struggled for anything in his life. "Look at him," Emma announced to the crowd. "Look at your master without his clothes, without his money, without his laws to protect him. What do you see? Just another man, pink and soft and weak. Nothing special, nothing that makes him better than us, except the accident of his birth and the money his granddaddy made selling our granddaddies." Thornfield stood there shaking, tears streaming down his face, his absolute power revealed as the illusion it had always been. Around him, his slaves were seeing their master not as an almost divine figure of authority, but as a frightened, naked man who looked remarkably small without his clothes and his confidence. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, I have children. I have a family." "So did my daddy," Emma replied without emotion. "So did every person you sold away from here. So did Samuel Jenkins, before Morrison whipped him to death for learning to read. Having family didn't protect them from your greed. Why should it protect you?" She raised the whip again, and Thornfield closed his eyes, waiting for the blow that would teach him what it felt like to be property instead of owner. But the strike never came. Instead, Emma lowered Sweet Susanna to her side and spoke words that would be remembered long after the physical wounds of this day had healed. "I ain't gonna kill you," she said quietly. "Death would be mercy, and mercy is something you got to earn. Instead, you're gonna live. You're gonna live with the knowledge that everything you thought you knew about power and control was wrong. You're gonna live knowing that your slaves saw you naked and afraid and begging for your life. You're gonna live in a world where the natural order has been overturned, where the last have become first and the mighty have fallen." She turned away from him then, addressing the crowd of slaves who hung on her every word. "Today, we learned something important," she called out, her voice carrying across the field. "We learned that masters are just men, and men can be broken. We learned that whips can change hands, that chains can be unlocked, that freedom is something we can take for ourselves if we're willing to pay the price." The slaves began to cheer then, their voices rising in a sound that had never been heard on Magnolia Grove before. The sound of people who'd remembered they were human beings with human rights that no law could truly take away. The story of Emma and the whip spread like wildfire through the quarters that night, and from there, it jumped plantation to plantation faster than any horse could carry it, faster than any ship could sail it, faster than any law could stop it. By the time the morning horn blew, every slave within 50 miles knew that something had changed at Magnolia Grove, something that might change everything everywhere if people had the courage to believe it was possible. Young Marcus was the first to start telling the tale proper, standing in the center of the quarters with all the children gathered round him like he was Moses himself come down from the mountain with new commandments. His voice carried the rhythm of the old storytellers, the ones who'd kept African memory alive through centuries of American bondage. "Listen here, children," he began, his words falling into the ancient cadence of survival and resistance. "Y'all know about David and Goliath, about how the little shepherd boy laid low the giant with nothing but a sling and a stone. But today, I'm gonna tell you about Emma and the whip, about how one woman stood up to the whole weight of slavery and made it tremble." The children leaned in close, their eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. They'd grown up with stories of miraculous escapes and underground railroads, tales of slaves who'd found freedom in the North or death trying to reach it. But they'd never heard a story like this one, about a slave who'd stayed and fought instead of running, who'd turned the master's own weapons against him. "She took 347 lashes," Marcus continued, his voice rising with the drama of it. 347 strikes of Morrison's whip across her back, and she never broke, never begged, never cried out for mercy. And when that whip fell silent, when Morrison thought he'd finally beaten her spirit down to nothing, that's when Emma rose up like the very hand of God and took sweet Susanna for herself. From cabin to cabin, the story traveled, gaining details with each telling, growing larger and more mythical as it passed from mouth to mouth. By midnight, slaves 3 counties over were whispering about the woman who'd caught a whip in midair and turned it on her tormentor. By dawn, the tale had reached Charleston and Savannah and Augusta, carried by drivers and boat hands and all the invisible networks that connected the enslaved South. But the story didn't just spread among the slaves. White folks heard it too, and what they heard made them check their locks twice before going to bed, made them look at their own human property with new eyes and sudden unease. If it could happen at Magnolia Grove, it could happen anywhere. If one woman could stand up to the whip, what was to stop others from following her example? Master Thornfield tried to contain the damage, sending riders to neighboring plantations with explanations and reassurances. It was an isolated incident, he claimed. One mentally disturbed slave having a breakdown, nothing more. Morrison had simply been careless, had let his guard down, had failed to maintain proper discipline. It would never happen again. But his words rang hollow, even to his own ears. How do you explain away the impossible? How do you dismiss something that every witness swore they'd seen with their own eyes? How do you restore faith in a system that had just revealed its fundamental weakness for everyone to see? The truth was that Emma had done something more dangerous than killing an overseer or burning down a plantation. She'd shown that the emperor had no clothes, that the mighty weren't really mighty, that the whole structure of slavery rested on nothing more than the slave's willingness to accept their own powerlessness. And once that illusion was broken, it could never be fully repaired. In the weeks that followed, small acts of resistance began breaking out across the South like brush fires in dry season. Slaves moved a little slower, worked a little less efficiently, forgot instructions a little more often. Tools went missing, cotton was contaminated with dirt and debris. Work songs carried new lyrics that spoke of freedom and revolution. Most dangerous of all, the whispering started. In hush harbors and praise houses, in the deep woods where slaves gathered on Sunday evenings, in the quiet moments between sunset and sleep, people began to talk. They talked about Emma and what she'd done, about the look in Master Thornfield's eyes when he stood naked and afraid, about the possibility that change might be coming, whether the white folks wanted it or not. The story grew in the telling, as stories do. Emma became 10 feet tall in some versions, able to catch bullets in her bare hands and walk through fire without being burned. Sweet Susanna became a magic whip that could only be wielded by the righteous, a weapon forged by the ancestors themselves to strike down oppression wherever it reared its ugly head. But underneath all the myth-making and embellishment, the core truth remained. One woman had said no when everyone expected her to say yes. One woman had stood up when everyone expected her to stay down. One woman had proven that the chains were only as strong as the willingness to wear them, and that truth, more than any whip or gun or law, was what terrified the masters. Because if one slave could remember her humanity strongly enough to fight for it, what was to stop others from remembering theirs? The story of Emma spread north too, carried by Underground Railroad conductors and abolitionists who recognized its power to inspire resistance. In Boston and Philadelphia and New York, free blacks gathered in churches and meeting halls to hear about the woman who'd taken the whip from her overseer's hand and used it to write a new chapter in the long book of struggle. Frederick Douglass himself spoke about Emma at a gathering in Rochester, using her story to illustrate the inherent dignity that slavery could never truly destroy. "There is something in the human spirit," he declared, "that cannot be broken by chains or whips or laws. Emma of Georgia has reminded us of that truth, and in doing so, she has reminded us of our own power." Harriet Tubman, preparing for another journey south to lead more souls to freedom, smiled when she heard the tale and said simply, "About time somebody down there remembered how to fight back proper. Maybe that spark will catch fire and spread." And spread it did, carried by every tongue that spoke it, every ear that heard it, every heart that was stirred by the promise it contained. The story of Emma became a song, became a prayer, became a promise that change was coming whether the masters were ready for it or not. Because some stories are more than entertainment. Some stories are seeds that, once planted, grow into revolutions. Years have passed since that blood-soaked afternoon when Emma took Sweet Susanna from Morrison's trembling hands and showed a plantation full of witnesses that even the most beaten-down soul could rise up and bite back. I'm an old man now, my hair white as cotton, and my back bent from carrying these memories for so long, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. Remember it because I was there, standing in that circle of slaves, watching impossibility become reality before my very eyes. My name was Marcus then, though folks called me Little Marcus to tell me apart from my daddy, Big Marcus, who got sold away when I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I was maybe 15 years old that day, full of rage and hopelessness, like most young slaves, certain that my whole life would be spent making white folks rich, while they treated me like something less than human. But Emma changed all that. Emma, and that whip, and the ancestors who came down to witness justice finally getting its due. She showed us something we'd forgotten in all our years of bondage. Showed us that we were people, not property. And people got the right to fight for their freedom, no matter what laws said different. That's why I'm telling you this story now, here in the fading light of another Georgia evening, with the Spanish moss hanging heavy, and the fireflies starting to blink their ancient messages through the summer heat. Because some stories are too important to let die with the people who lived them. Some stories got to be passed down, mouth to mouth, heart to heart, until they become part of the very air we breathe. Emma never did make it to freedom, not the way most folks think of it. 3 weeks after she whipped Morrison and humiliated Master Thornfield, the patty rollers came for her with dogs and guns and enough rope to hang half the county. But they never found her alive. They found her body floating in the Chattahoochee River, her arms spread wide like she was embracing the water, her face peaceful as a sleeping child's. Some folks said she drowned trying to escape. Others claimed Morrison had finally got his revenge. But I know better, because I was the last person to see Emma alive, the last person to hear her voice before she walked into that river and let the current take her home. She came to me in the dead of night, 3 days before they found her body, appearing in my cabin like a spirit made flesh. Her back was still a ruin of scarred tissue from Morrison's whip, but her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes were bright as stars and twice as peaceful. "I got to go now, little Marcus," she said, sitting on my straw pallet like we were old friends sharing secrets. "My work here is finished, and the ancestors are calling me home." I begged her to stay, to keep fighting, to help us turn that spark she'd lit into a fire that could burn down the whole plantation system. But Emma just smiled and shook her head, her voice gentle as summer rain. "Child, you don't understand yet what really happened that day. I didn't break no chains. Chains are made of iron, and iron can be forged again. What I broke was something deeper than that. I broke the lie that said we got to accept whatever white folks dish out. I broke the fear that kept us from remembering who we really are." She reached into her dress and pulled out something wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, a small bag sewn from scraps of African kente that had somehow survived the Middle Passage and 3 generations of American slavery. Inside was a handful of soil, dark and rich and smelling of home. "This here is earth from the land our ancestors walked before the ships came," she said, pressing the bag into my palm. "Mama Juba gave it to me when I was little. Said it would keep me connected to the old ways, the old power. Now I'm giving it to you because the story ain't over. The story's just beginning." She told me then what I had to do, how to tell the tale properly, how to keep the flame burning, how to pass the story down until it became legend, and legend became truth that nobody could argue with. She made me promise to remember not just what happened, but what it meant. Not just the facts, but the feeling of watching a broken woman become whole again through the power of her own defiance. "You tell them," she said as she prepared to leave. "You tell them that Emma wasn't special because she was stronger or braver or smarter than anybody else. Emma was special because she remembered something we all got inside us. The knowledge that we're human beings made in God's image, and no amount of whips or chains or laws can change that truth. I kept that promise, kept it through the Civil War, when the world finally caught up to what Emma had been trying to tell us. Kept it through Reconstruction, when freedom turned out to be more complicated than any of us had imagined. Kept it through all the years that followed, when new kinds of chains got forged to replace the old ones. And I'm keeping it now, passing the story on to you the way Emma passed it to me. the way the griots of Africa passed down wisdom from generation to generation, mouth to mouth, heart to heart, soul to soul. Because Emma's fight ain't over. It just changed shape, put on new clothes, found new ways to manifest in each generation. Every time somebody stands up to injustice, every time somebody refuses to accept less than their full humanity, every time somebody takes the whip from their oppressor's hand and uses it to right their own freedom. That's Emma's spirit still working in the world. The old ones warned us that some stories carry the weight of iron and fire, and this here is one of them. The story of a woman who took 600 lashes and turned them into the first blow for freedom. The story of a slave who remembered she was human and made the whole world remember it with her. Her name was Emma, and she lived and died in Georgia, and her blood is mixed with the red clay that grows the cotton and feeds the trees. But her spirit belongs to all of us, to every person who ever felt the weight of chains and dreamed of breaking free. So you remember this story, you hear. You remember Emma and sweet Susanna, and the day the whip changed hands at Magnolia Grove. You remember it and you tell it, because some stories are too powerful to die, too true to be forgotten, too important to let slip away into the darkness of forgetting. The suffering was real, the resistance was real, the courage was real, and the promise Emma made with her blood is real too. The promise that freedom ain't something you get given. It's something you take for yourself when you finally remember who you really are. Who lived will live again. Who died for freedom ain't really dead. Who suffered, suffered with purpose. And who remembers keeps the flame burning for all of us. This story lives on in the whispered prayers of the quarters, in the work songs that carry coded freedom, in the faces of children who ain't learned yet to bow their heads when the massa walks by. It lives in every act of resistance, every moment of defiance, every soul who refuses to stay broken, no matter how hard the world tries to break them. The chains might have been real, but so was the spirit that broke them. The whips might have drawn blood, but that blood watered seeds of revolution that are still growing today. Emma might have died in that river, but her story flows on forever, carrying truth downstream to every heart that's ready to hear it. And that's how we keep faith with the ancestors. That's how we honor the sacrifice. That's how we make sure the fire never goes out, by telling the stories, by remembering the names, by keeping alive the memory of those who paid the price for our freedom with their blood and tears and unbreakable spirits. So when the night is dark and the load is heavy, when the world tries to tell you that you ain't worth nothing, when the chains, whatever form they take, try to convince you to stay down, you remember Emma. You remember that whip changing hands. You remember that even 600 lashes couldn't break a spirit that knew its own worth. And you remember that her fight is your fight. Her strength is your strength. Her victory is your victory too. Because we are all connected, all part of the same story, all carriers of the same flame that Emma lit that day when she took sweet Susanna and showed the world what freedom really looks like. The story don't end with Emma's death in that river. The story keeps going every time somebody tells it, every time somebody hears it, every time somebody feels that spark of defiance kindle in their own heart and decides to fan it into flame. Memory is the greatest freedom of all. And as long as we remember, as long as we tell the stories, as long as we keep the flame burning, Emma lives. The ancestors live. The promise of true freedom lives on. And so the legend grows, passes from one generation to the next, becomes part of the very ground we walk on, the very air we breathe. Emma's story, sweet Susanna's song, the day the whip changed hands, and everything changed with it. That's the truth I'm leaving you with, the treasure I'm passing down, not gold or silver or land, but something more precious than any of those. The story of a woman who refused to stay broken, who took the master's whip and used it to write her own freedom song. Keep it safe, keep it alive, keep it burning bright. For the ancestors, for the children, for all the Emmas who are still out there, still fighting, still proving that the human spirit can't be chained, can't be broken, can't be killed, as long as somebody remembers their name and tells their story true. The suffering was real, but so was the resistance. The pain was deep, but the courage was deeper. The chains were strong, but the spirit that broke them was stronger still, and that spirit lives on in every telling, every remembering, every heart that beats with the rhythm of freedom and refuses to be silenced. This is how we honor the dead, by keeping their stories alive, by making their struggles our struggles, by carrying their flame into whatever darkness we face. Emma, sweet Susanna, the day the whip changed hands. Remember it, tell it, live it, and when folks ask you where you heard this story, you tell them you heard it here, in these legends of the lost slave quarters, where the voices of the ancestors still echo through the night wind, still whisper their truths to any soul brave enough to listen.